Hey guys, so of course we just had the ban list. Super exciting. That has to be one of my favorite ban lists of all time. I think they hit a lot of cards that actually made things for the better. I mean, sure, they missed some, but when did they not miss anything? And overall, I think it was a very huge hit. So as usual, I want to provide sort of like a tier list of the upcoming meta. Definitely, up to interpretation, and I'm really looking forward to your discussion as well in terms of what you think and how things will change. So of course, Memento won the YCS, so super cool. Although at the same time, I think I would still put them at tier 2 though. I think that is probably fair. I don't think they still reached tier 1 status. It was sort of a sleeper pick in terms of winning that YCS, and definitely very well deserved. I think this deck is so scary. Even when it goes second, it always seems to have so much gas in being able to OTK, and it also has the ability to like attack directly with like their big monsters as well, and it just has a lot of tools essentially. And in terms of hand traps, I mean, Shifter has always been its #1 kryptonite. There was just essentially there was just no way to play around that card, and now we finally hit Shifter, and that's going to be kind of the theme for a lot of the different decks here, where we sort of end up getting beefed up because of that hit. I want to just straight up I still think Ryziel is going to be the strongest, but also the most represented. They did get a lot of hits, of course, all their main decks cards getting hit to 2, and I think that's a really cool way to do it now. It's sort of, the semi-limited list used to be kind of, for the most part, useless unless you have things like, let's say, Mali, which kind of flip back and forth a lot. But now they're actually starting to use that for like their main deck or like the main deck monsters, because something like Razia and Malice, it was a little bit hard to hit those cards in terms of their core cards, just because not a single one is exactly entirely problematic in terms of ban worthy or something like that. So instead they just hit a lot of them at 2, and I think Ryziel, while they did get some notable hits, detonated to 1 as well, but I think they're still going to be the top, and I think that's kind of okay, especially with the deck losing also, not to mention Bonfire, but cross out and things like that, talents, and that just made it really hard. Hand traps should resolve, at least in my view, and I think it just made things a little fairer, even if the representation might still be relatively similar. And similar thing with Malice. I think I've been seeing a lot in terms of how, I mean, they definitely got very big hits. If anything, arguably more hits than Ryziel, which is kind of funny considering Ryziel definitely had way more representation, although Malice definitely felt very strong to play against. And I think the thing I like about the hits now is that hand traps might actually do something. And I'm talking about hand traps outside of lands here, right? It was just so bizarre to me how if you open, let's say, Imperm Nibiru, in historically most formats, like those two, if you open those 2 hand traps, it should just be a clear wipeout. But against something like Malice, that just wasn't the case. And now hand traps might actually do something. Some would argue it's not even tier 1 status anymore. They will get some support though, post Alliance Insight. But I think for the time being, if we look at purely also from like a representation standpoint and not just power level, I think Malice, at least especially at the beginning, I think people will still try to make things work, and I think it'll be enough where it just still seems to be like these 2 decks for the most part. Odeon, so this along with Fiendsmith stuff, which Fiendsmith stuff has not been hit yet, which makes it really strong. I think this deck going first is really scary. I mean, it basically has their traps, which is kind of like a hot red form of negate. It is definitely really hard to go through all of that, but realistically, a lot of decks just in general in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you go first, you're going to be really strong. Even rogue decks going second, this deck, and I'm talking about like sort of like the pure version, it's going to struggle, right, being like a trap deck and having to play a lot of those main deck. So that's what I think the biggest weakness of this deck is, but I think it's still pretty cool. I've even seen this with like Ryziel stuff, which is really funny. I'm not sure how that works as well once now that these Ryziel cards have gotten hit, but at least you still have like Fiendsmith and everything. Labyrinth, this did really well, of course, at the stream. If you saw that, it just seems to just tear things up. I'm still gonna put it at the rogue though. Just leading up into this format, representation wise, it really didn't have any tops at all. It actually didn't even make my meta tier list by the data video that I did at the beginning of the month, just because there just weren't that many tops with this deck. But I think it's still deserving at least of a shout out here. At the very least, rogue. I think just, I mean, they sometimes sided Shifter. They lost that. I don't think that's a big deal. Obviously, that's not something that they relied on entirely. And, they can still play really power cards like, let's say, Impulse. And, yeah, honestly, some of the traps you've seen, like the Daruma Cannon, especially on stream, it can go really strong in this format. And you have still some stuff like, let's say, D-Barrier, which isn't as good nowadays. And then you had something like Different Dimension Ground if they played it, which would be great against something like, let's say, Mermail. And speaking of Mermail, I would still put it at tier 2. They got an indirect hit in Bahamut Shirk, which is actually notable. Not just the fact that they don't get towed anymore, which made them nib proof essentially. Usually came up like by the 5th summon, but now the Bahamut Shark also, it's affected just like detach and trigger things. That's and like goons and everything. That's where it was really strong too. I mean, I'm sure there's like some other workarounds. I was seeing some posts and like some buyouts maybe on some other cards that they could use as a replacement, but I think just the fact that they lose Toad is pretty big, because hand ripping is very strong, yes, but the hand ripping plus double Toad or even with single Toad, that's what made it really impossible to go through. Or let's say they don't do the hand rip, they still have like the water barrier, I guess, but I think not having Toad really makes things different. And although at the same time, there's no Dweller, which is huge, and there's no Shifter. And the Dweller, you would have noticed with like Razio on the stream, it really was just like a game ender against Malice and it's on its own. So it got indirectly beefed up in that regard, but it just becomes a lot more vulnerable now without the Toad access. So I would still put it here for now. I think it's still, people will still try to figure it out. White Forest, they were kind of sneaky, I want to say, in terms of tops, even coming into this format. I know we didn't see too much success at this YCS, but I think this is probably near like the bottom of tier 2, maybe top of Rogue. It was actually getting a decent amount of tops with the Azamina stuff. And again, with like Shifter being gone, for a lot of these decks, they just sort of indirectly get better. Droll is still around though, so this is going to be kind of it is pretty weak to Droll. Tenpai, we're going to just put this in Rogue. They lost Shifter, which is one of the indirect kind of like counters, essentially, because they kind of relied on it. I mean, I don't want to say completely relied on it, but it is definitely something that was very strong for them as they are going second deck predominantly. So yeah, I don't think anyone's really sad about that. Tenpai has been pretty annoying, and it's actually almost surprising how even with all those direct hits to their main deck monsters, they somehow manage to still get tops after that. But they are usually played with Fiendsmith stuff now, and honestly, some of them they just go first too. So I think that's where they still at least are able to keep alive. And speaking of Fiendsmith, let's just say like Fiendsmith Bestial, Fiendsmith Kashira, that I'll just put it here for now. They are, as I have always said in my tier list videos, Fiendsmith, like Cashier, Fiendsmith, Bestial, doesn't really feel like a true deck to me. It just seems like just like a trade binder, basically. But yeah, Fiendsmith stuff didn't get hit. It's super consistent. I'm sure it's going to see a lot of play, and so we're going to put it here for now. So let's just see how that goes. Fire King has been actually really solid. It has a good Razio matchup, and I think, yeah, honestly, if you know how to play this deck, it can be really grindy, and it just keeps coming back. Everything just floats. I think it's really nice. They did lose Bonfire, though, but you know what? I'm sure they can still find a way to hang around. I just put Sprite here because I was going to put tier elements here into this video anyways, just because of, like, I don't know, Power of the Elements, I guess. It's awful. Don't play this deck right now. So it already loses completely to Detonator. And I love Sprite, by the way. That's the only reason I'm saying this. The other thing with Sprite was that it could side Shifter for going second, because while it cannot play optimally under Shifter, it can still play enough where it can OTK under Shifter. And that's where it can be pretty strong. And now they lost that. Obviously, they're not relying on that, but as sort of like a rogue option, Shifter could be so strong. Again, kind of like before this format, more so in Snake Eye format. So yeah, I think Sprite lost a lot of advantages there in that regard. Crystron, so I would still put this at tier 2. I think somewhere around here, maybe. I don't know. Like, the order among here is not as really important, or rather as precise. I think this deck has been sneakily doing pretty good. Malice and people siding Lancea for it is what sort of hampered this deck for the most part. And who knows, maybe with all those hits to Malice, maybe not every deck starts side decking Lancea, as we have been seeing so far, right? So that can be indirectly better for Crystron as well. I think, honestly, the deck is pretty solid. Going for us, like setting up like Cyber Dragon Infinity. They can also go into like their Crystron Synchro, which can sort of banish monsters. They have an FA Dawn Draxter play. Sometimes they play with like Cashier stuff to try to play around Lancea, I guess. But maybe, again, you don't have to worry about that as much. I'm not too sure. And a lot of different hand traps may not be as good. Droll, it's funny, when I did the survey of Crystron players, they said sometimes Droll can be really a big hindrance, depending on if they start with like the Tiger one. But realistically, I've always felt Droll has been very weak against this deck. Ghost Ogre also kind of sucks. Valor Imperm, like Ash, I think is pretty good. But for the most part, I think this deck is really solid. Centurion, I'm going to put it a rogue. I know what? I'll give him more than Tenpai, though. I think this deck is actually pretty strong. Just in terms of, at least in terms of as a synchro deck, technically, and I play Blue Eyes myself, I actually think synchro end board with like Centurion is actually a lot more stronger than something like Blue Eyes, but definitely has not been seeing too much play. Shifter hit doesn't actually affect this deck at all, just because if anything, this deck sometimes actually played Shifter on their own. It wasn't ideal for them, but they could definitely still play under it. So that part doesn't do too much. I don't think Dweller really does anything for them either. But I think, you know what, I definitely like to give respect to Centurion. And speaking of Synchro, let's go with Blue Eyes. From a representation standpoint, definitely I think it would be at the top of tier 2. Some would even argue tier 1. As I mentioned, I do play this deck myself. I could see it potentially being tier 1 from a representation standpoint, but from a power level, I truly do not believe this to be like a tier 1 deck. Like, it's strong, like the Primate stuff really carries as well, but the deck, the obvious bricking issues is one. Going second can be pretty challenging with this deck in engine alone. This deck never had a good matchup into Razio or Malice, which was ironic considering this was considered the third best deck and it had bad matchups into the top 2 decks. It was a very distant third place. So I think it's still going to be there. It got indirectly better. Shifter being gone is really big for Blue Eyes, and we've lost Druid's Worm, where there's only one now. So Bestial is also one strong, because if you manage to get rid of both Blue Eyes and they already went through Roar, like, it's probably game for them. So I think Blue Eyes, it's more so indirectly they've gotten better. There's definitely some challenges. Like, the deck can kind of just lose to itself, though, is where I think the main concern is. You have Yubel. So I'm going to put this top of Rogue. For now, it wasn't doing too well in terms of tops coming into this. I mean, Sharvara came to 2. Realistically, I think Yubel, though, I don't think they actually played this Sharvara at more than 1 if they wanted to, or if they needed to. I don't think they do. I think it's very strong, as I mentioned before in the past. You know, if they go first and uninterrupted, probably has one of the better end boards for sure. I think it's just all the mulch armies hit this deck so well. You have Fualas that's now going to be much more accessible with Quarter Century Stampede, and I think that is what makes it rough. I just realized I should have put Unchained into this tier list. I apologize. That should be in here somewhere, kind of similar to, I guess, maybe it's better than even Yubel. Who knows in terms of tiers? Definitely let me know where you think Unchained should be. Chimera, I'm going to also give this on top of something like Tenpai, because they play with Fiendsmith, and it actually goes really, really well with this deck. And of course, Fiendsmith did not get hit going first. This essentially like hand loops, at least for one. Their D-Bells forces you to set and pops that, and then that's essentially 2 hand rips. So yeah, honestly, I think going first, this deck is so scary. Again, Droll can, for the most part, will be pretty big against this strategy, so that's where it succumbs there. I'm going to put Branded here. As some of you may know, I've been playing Branded for 2 years straight, and as much as I love this deck, I was really shocked Branded Fusion didn't come to 2 when they already brought back like Snake Eyes, Poplar, and Ash to 2 right after. I get it, they lost Bonfire, but still, it was just a little weird to me, especially since last list they banned Gamic Puppet Nightmare, which should have been gone, although Sanctify should have been gone instead anyways. But they were hitting that when Branded wasn't even like tier 2 status at all. It was already a rogue deck at that point. So it was a little bit puzzling. There is like that Dragon Tail stuff that's coming out later. I'm not sure when exactly in the TCG, but that should be that should have some synergy with Branded as well. So maybe that's why. I'm not sure. Some of these other ones, like, yeah, Voiceless, honestly, I would put it better than, let's say, it would be somewhere around like Branded and like around in this other category to me. Droll is still around, but not having Shifter, of course, definitely strong for them. And then lastly, you know what? Let's just give some love to Tearlaments. Maybe they could even hit Rogue status. I mean, you lost Shifter, you lost Abyssdola. That is huge for Tearlaments. Wasn't really seeing a lot of tops lately, though, but there might be some resurgence there. The Danger's coming back. I'm not sure if they would play that again. If, for those of you recall, when Power of the Elements first came out, Tearlaments, they went along with Dangerous pretty well, and then they eventually moved towards, you know, like the Shizu stuff when that came out. So I'm not sure if they would go back to that as well, but the options are there. So, and you still have Grass at 1 that's legal, and perhaps we see a bit of a resurgence in Tearlaments. But anyways, that's just sort of my overview on what the meta might look like. Obviously, you know, I'm really looking forward to your discussion on what you think will happen. Again, sorry that I forgot about Unchained. It just completely went over my head. But anyways, huge thanks to you, for all of you, for watching. Big thanks to my sponsors and patrons as always for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.